In the mountains of Afghanistan, soldiers whispered about a shadow that moved between rocks and ridges. They called her Anphal, the one who brings silence. No enemy who came within 3,000 meters of her position ever lived to describe her face. Some said she was a myth, a story told to boost morale. Others swore they had seen the aftermath of her work, targets eliminated with impossible precision from distances that defied belief. But Anphal was very real. Her name was Captain Sarah Mitchell, and she was about to become the most feared sniper in modern warfare. This is her true story, a tale of survival, sacrifice, and the price of becoming a legend that enemies feared and allies barely understood. The war would end, but the ghost in the mountains would haunt both sides forever. Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her steady hands and sharp eyes would one day make her a legend whispered about in enemy camps across Afghanistan. Growing up in rural Montana, she learned to shoot by hunting elk with her grandfather, a Korean War veteran who taught her that patience and precision mattered more than speed and aggression. The morning that changed everything started like any other at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Captain Mitchell was cleaning her rifle, a custom Barrett M82 that she had modified over months of deployment, when Lieutenant Rodriguez burst into the sniper hide with news that made her blood run cold. Intelligence had intercepted communications about a planned attack on a nearby village where American medics were treating wounded civilians. The enemy force was estimated at 30 fighters, heavily armed and moving through mountain passes that provided perfect cover. Traditional air support was impossible due to cloud cover, and ground troops were hours away. The villagers, including dozens of children, would be slaughtered before help could arrive. Sarah knew that she and her spotter, Sergeant David Kim, were the only thing standing between innocent lives and certain death. They moved out within minutes, carrying enough supplies for a 3-day operation. The terrain was brutal, with rocky slopes that cut through their gear and altitude that made every step feel like running a marathon. Sarah had spent months studying these mountains, memorizing every ridge and valley, understanding how wind patterns changed with the time of day and weather conditions. As they climbed toward their chosen position, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her here. She had joined the Army after college, driven by a desire to serve her country and test herself against the ultimate challenges. Sniper school had been the hardest thing she had ever done, both physically and mentally. The instructors pushed candidates beyond their limits, teaching them not just marksmanship, but the psychological discipline needed to take lives from a distance. What separated Sarah from other snipers was not just her natural talent, but her ability to become completely still, both in body and mind. While other soldiers fidgeted during long waits, Sarah could remain motionless for hours, her breathing so controlled that she seemed to merge with the landscape itself. This skill had earned her the nickname Ghost among her unit, though she never knew that enemies would soon have their own name for her. The climb took 6 hours, and by the time they reached the overwatch position, the sun was setting behind jagged peaks. Sarah set up her rifle while Kim established communication with base and began ranging targets with his spotting scope. The village lay spread below them, a collection of mud brick houses and narrow streets that had existed for centuries. Through her scope, Sarah could see the medics working in the village square, treating wounds and distributing supplies. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying faintly across the distance. The scene looked peaceful, but intelligence reports indicated that enemy fighters were already moving into position in the surrounding hills. As darkness fell, Sarah and Kim took turns on watch, maintaining communication with the village security team through encrypted radios. The medics had been warned about the potential threat, but evacuation was not possible due to critically wounded patients who could not be moved. Around midnight, Kim spotted movement on a ridgeline 2,000 meters to the north. Through night vision equipment, they could see fighters setting up what appeared to be a mortar position. Sarah adjusted her scope and began calculating wind speed, temperature, and humidity. At this distance, even tiny environmental factors could mean the difference between a clean kill and a miss that would expose their position. The first shot came at 12:47 a.m. Sarah had been tracking the mortar team leader through her scope for nearly 20 minutes, waiting for the perfect moment when wind conditions aligned with her calculations. The Barrett's massive .50 caliber round crossed 2,000 meters in less than 3 seconds, striking the target with devastating effect. The mortar position dissolved into chaos, as fighters scattered, but Sarah was already tracking her next target. Over the next hour, she methodically eliminated 6 enemy fighters, each shot coming from a different angle as she and Kim moved between prepared positions. The enemy could not determine where the shots were coming from, only that their comrades were dying with surgical precision from an impossible distance. By dawn, the immediate threat to the village had been neutralized, but Sarah knew this was only the beginning. Radio intercepts indicated that enemy commanders were furious about the losses and were mobilizing a much larger force to find and eliminate what they were calling the ghost sniper. As they prepared to withdraw to a new position, Kim asked Sarah if she ever felt anything when she pulled the trigger. She considered the question carefully before answering. Each target was someone's son, brother, or father, but they had come to murder innocent people. Her job was to stop them, and she had made peace with what that required. The walk back to base took most of the day, and when they finally arrived, Sarah learned that word of her night's work had already spread throughout the command structure. The village was safe. The medics had completed their mission, and no American lives had been lost. But she also learned something that would change everything about how she approached future operations. Intelligence officers showed her intercepted communications in which enemy fighters described the attacks in terrified whispers. They spoke of shots coming from impossible distances, of comrades dying before anyone heard gunfire, of a presence in the mountains that could strike anywhere at any time. Someone had started using the name Anphal, a local word that meant one who brings silence. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, called Sarah into his office that evening. He explained that her actions had achieved something unprecedented. Enemy morale in the entire sector was plummeting as word spread about the mysterious sniper. Recruitment was down, and several planned attacks had been canceled as fighters refused to operate in areas where Anphal might be watching. But the colonel also warned her that this notoriety came with a price. Enemy commanders had placed a substantial bounty on her head, and were bringing in their best fighters specifically to hunt her down. Every mission from now on would be exponentially more dangerous as the enemy focused their resources on eliminating the threat she represented. Sarah understood the implications, but she also recognized the opportunity. If enemy fighters were more afraid of her than they were motivated by their cause, she could use that fear as a weapon. The key would be maintaining the mystery while systematically dismantling enemy capabilities throughout the region. That night, as she cleaned her rifle and prepared for the next mission, Sarah began planning how to transform herself from a skilled sniper into something far more powerful, a legend that would haunt enemy fighters long after the war ended. She had no idea that within weeks her name would be spoken in fearful whispers across 3 provinces, or that she would soon face the greatest challenge of her military career when the enemy's most elite hunter arrived with orders to end the legend of Anphal once and for all. 3 weeks after the village incident, Sarah Mitchell had become a ghost story that spread through enemy camps faster than wildfire. Intelligence reports indicated that recruitment in the region had dropped by 60%, and several veteran fighters had abandoned their units rather than face the mysterious sniper they called Anphal. But Sarah knew that her growing reputation was also painting an enormous target on her back. The first sign that things were changing came during a routine patrol surveillance mission. Sarah and Kim were positioned on a ridgeline overlooking a known smuggling route, when Kim noticed something that made his blood run cold. Through his spotting scope, he could see enemy fighters moving with unusual discipline and coordination, using techniques that suggested professional military training. These were not the usual insurgents they had been tracking. These men moved with precision, maintained proper spacing, and used hand signals that indicated advanced tactical knowledge. More concerning was their equipment: high-end optics, modern camouflage, and weapons that were far superior to anything local fighters typically carried. Sarah adjusted her scope to get a better view of the group's leader, a tall man with distinctive scarring across his left cheek. Something about his movement patterns and the way he scanned the terrain sent warning signals through her experienced mind. This was someone who understood counter-sniper tactics, someone who knew how to hunt the hunters. The mission briefing that evening confirmed her worst fears. Intelligence had identified the scarred man as Dmitry Volkov, a former Russian Spetsnaz sniper who had gone freelance after leaving the military under mysterious circumstances. Volkov had been hired specifically to eliminate Anphal and he had brought with him a team of experienced operators who specialized in tracking and killing enemy snipers. Colonel Martinez explained that Volkov's reputation was built on a series of successful missions across Africa and the Middle East, where he had eliminated several high-value targets who had thought themselves untouchable. His preferred method was to study his target's patterns and psychological profile, then set elaborate traps that forced them into disadvantageous positions. But Sarah had advantages that Volkov's previous targets had lacked. She knew these mountains better than anyone, having spent months mapping every valley, ridge, and cave system in her area of operations. More importantly, she understood that her greatest weapon was not her rifle, but the fear she had already instilled in enemy fighters throughout the region. The psychological warfare began immediately. Sarah started varying her operational patterns in ways designed to maximize confusion and terror among enemy forces. Instead of taking single, precise shots from extreme distances, she began conducting what she privately called ghost walks, missions where she would eliminate multiple targets across a wide area in a single night, creating the impression that she could be everywhere at once. On one memorable evening, she and Kim eliminated 7 enemy fighters across a 15-kilometer stretch of mountain terrain, with each kill occurring exactly 1 hour apart. Radio intercepts later revealed that enemy commanders were convinced they were facing not one sniper, but an entire team of supernatural marksmen who could move through solid rock. Volkov, however, was not impressed by psychological tactics. Intelligence reports indicated that he was systematically analyzing every one of Sarah's kills, looking for patterns in her shot placement, timing. He had even visited several of her previous hide sites, studying the subtle signs that might reveal her preferred tactics and equipment choices. The first direct confrontation came during what should have been a routine Overwatch mission. Sarah and Kim were providing security for a convoy moving through a dangerous mountain pass, when Sarah noticed something that made her instantly alert. A glint of light from a ridge nearly 3,000 meters away. Exactly the kind of reflection that might come from a rifle scope. As she studied the area through her own scope, Sarah realized that someone was watching the convoy through optics from a position that would be perfect for a long-range ambush. The angle was wrong for local fighters, who typically attacked from closer ranges with rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons. This had to be Volkov. Sarah found herself in an impossible situation. If she moved to engage the distant sniper, she would abandon her mission to protect the convoy. But if Volkov was planning to target the convoy, her current position would not allow her to prevent the attack. She made a decision that went against every tactical manual, but reflected the reality of fighting an opponent who understood conventional sniper doctrine. She told Kim to maintain overwatch on the convoy while she moved to engage the enemy sniper. This meant operating without a spotter, something that violated basic sniper principles but was necessary given the circumstances. Sarah began a careful movement toward a position that would give her a clear shot at Volkov's hide site while remaining concealed from his observation. The stalk took 2 hours, with Sarah moving only a few meters at a time to avoid detection. As she got closer to her intended firing position, she realized that Volkov had anticipated this possibility. The hide site she had been watching was empty, except for a carefully positioned mirror designed to create the scope glint she had detected. Sarah found herself caught in the open, halfway between her original position and the decoy hide site, when she heard the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle from an entirely different direction. The bullet struck the rock next to her head, sending granite fragments across her face and confirming that Volkov had been watching her the entire time. Rolling behind the largest boulder she could find, Sarah realized that she was facing an opponent who understood her tactics better than she had anticipated. Volkov had used her own aggressive instincts against her, drawing her away from her support and into a position where he held every advantage. For the next 6 hours, Sarah and Volkov engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse across the mountainous terrain. Every time Sarah thought she had identified his position, she would find another decoy or discover that he had already moved to a new location. Volkov, meanwhile, was systematically eliminating her escape routes and forcing her toward a valley where she would be completely exposed. As the sun began to set, Sarah realized that traditional sniper tactics were not going to work against an opponent who had studied her methods so thoroughly. She needed to do something completely unexpected. something that would turn Volkov's knowledge of conventional doctrine against him. Drawing on her childhood hunting experience, Sarah remembered a technique her grandfather had taught her for tracking elk through heavy timber. Instead of trying to outshoot Volkov in a conventional sniper duel, she would use the terrain and her superior knowledge of the local area to create an opportunity that he could not anticipate. Sarah began a series of movements designed to convince Volkov that she was attempting to escape through a narrow canyon that led back toward her base. She left subtle signs of her passage: disturbed stones, broken vegetation, even a single expended rifle cartridge where he would be sure to find it. As she had hoped, Volkov took the bait and began moving to intercept her at the canyon's exit point. But Sarah had never entered the canyon. Instead, she had climbed to a position directly above the path he would have to take, using a route that required mountaineering skills rather than tactical movement. The final confrontation came as Volkov moved through a narrow defile, completely focused on the canyon exit where he expected to find his target. Sarah's shot came from directly above him, a position he had not considered because it required her to climb an apparently impossible cliff face in complete darkness. The bullet struck Volkov's center mass, ending his threat permanently. But as Sarah climbed down to confirm the kill, she discovered something that changed her understanding of the entire situation. Volkov had been carrying detailed maps of American base locations, patrol routes, and operational schedules that could only have come from someone with high-level access to classified information. This had not been a simple bounty hunt by a freelance operator. Volkov had been part of a larger intelligence operation designed to eliminate key American assets and gather information for future attacks. His mission to kill Anphal had been only one part of a much more complex plan. As Sarah radioed for extraction, she realized that eliminating Volkov would not end the threat to her or her unit. If enemy intelligence services were willing to invest this kind of resources in hunting her down, they would certainly send others. The legend of Anphal had become both her greatest weapon and her greatest vulnerability. The helicopter that extracted her carried not just Sarah and Kim, but also Volkov's intelligence materials, which would prove crucial in identifying and stopping a planned attack on her base. But as they flew through the darkness towards safety, Sarah understood that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. She was no longer just a soldier following orders. She had become a strategic asset whose survival was essential to American operations in the region. The war had become personal in ways that would test everything she believed about duty, sacrifice, and the price of becoming a legend that enemies feared more than death itself. The intelligence materials recovered from Volkov's body revealed a conspiracy that reached far beyond anything Sarah Mitchell had imagined. Enemy forces had not only been tracking her movements but had also infiltrated American communication networks and compromised several local assets who had been providing information about patrol schedules and base security procedures. Colonel Martinez called an emergency briefing that included only the most trusted personnel on the base. The documents showed that enemy commanders had developed an elaborate plan to use Sarah's reputation as bait for a massive trap. They intended to stage a fake humanitarian crisis that would draw her into an impossible tactical situation where she would be forced to choose between abandoning innocent civilians or walking into an ambush that would guarantee her death. What made the plan particularly insidious was its psychological sophistication. Enemy intelligence had analyzed every one of Sarah's previous missions and identified her greatest weakness: her inability to ignore civilian casualties even when tactical doctrine demanded withdrawal. They planned to exploit this by creating a scenario where children would be placed in immediate danger, knowing that Anphal would respond regardless of the personal risk. Sarah studied the intelligence materials with growing anger and determination. The enemy's plan revealed not just their tactical thinking, but also their fundamental misunderstanding of what motivated her. They saw her compassion for civilians as a weakness to be exploited, when in reality it was the source of her strength and the reason she had become so effective at eliminating threats to innocent people. The fake crisis began 3 days later, exactly as the captured documents had predicted. Reports came in about a school in a remote village that had been occupied by enemy fighters who were holding children hostage. The situation was complicated by the fact that approaching ground forces would take hours to reach the location, and by the time they arrived, intelligence suggested that the hostages would already be dead. Colonel Martinez ordered Sarah to stand down, recognizing the obvious trap. but she knew that real children were genuinely at risk, regardless of the enemy's ultimate intentions. The intelligence materials had revealed the plan, but had not eliminated the humanitarian crisis that formed its foundation. Sarah made a decision that would define the final phase of her deployment. Instead of falling into the enemy's carefully prepared trap, she would turn their plan against them by doing something they could not possibly anticipate. She would rescue the children while simultaneously eliminating the threat they represented. Working with Kim and 2 other trusted soldiers, Sarah developed a plan that combined everything she had learned about psychological warfare, tactical surprise, and the terrain advantages she had spent months developing. Rather than approaching the village as a lone sniper attempting to eliminate targets from a distance, she would coordinate a multi-phase operation that would save the hostages while destroying the enemy's capability to launch similar attacks in the future. The operation began before dawn, with Sarah and her team moving to positions that surrounded the village from multiple directions. Instead of trying to conceal their presence, they made subtle moves designed to be detected by enemy observers, creating the impression that a large American force was preparing to assault the school. As expected, enemy fighters began moving to defensive positions around the building where the children were being held. This movement was exactly what Sarah had been hoping for, as it drew the fighters away from the hostages and into positions where they could be engaged without risk to innocent lives. The first phase of the attack began with Sarah eliminating the enemy's lookout posts from extreme range, using the same techniques that had made her legendary but applying them with surgical precision to create maximum psychological impact. Each shot was timed to occur exactly 3 minutes apart, creating a rhythm that enemy fighters would recognize as the signature of Anphal. As the lookouts disappeared one by one, panic began to spread through the enemy ranks. Radio intercepts revealed that fighters were abandoning their assigned positions and clustering around the school building, exactly as Sarah had predicted they would do when faced with the prospect of confronting the ghost sniper they had heard so much about. The second phase involved Kim and the other soldiers using flashbang grenades and smoke canisters to create chaos and confusion, while Sarah moved to a position where she could see directly into the school building. From this position, she could identify which individuals were actual fighters and which were civilians, allowing her to plan precise shots that would neutralize threats without endangering hostages. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years afterward. In a display of marksmanship that defied conventional understanding of what was humanly possible, Sarah eliminated 11 enemy fighters in less than 2 minutes, with each shot precisely calculated to avoid any risk to the children who were crouched on the floor nearby. The fighters who remained alive after this devastating assault were completely demoralized, convinced that they were facing not a human opponent but some kind of supernatural force that could strike anywhere at any time with perfect accuracy. Several threw down their weapons and fled, while others simply cowered in corners, too terrified to move. The rescue of the hostages was completed without a single civilian casualty, but Sarah knew that the real impact of the operation would be psychological rather than tactical. Word of what had happened would spread throughout the enemy network within hours, and the legend of Anphal would grow beyond anything that had come before. Intelligence reports over the following weeks confirmed that the operation had achieved effects that went far beyond the immediate tactical success. Enemy recruitment throughout the region collapsed completely, with many experienced fighters abandoning their units rather than risk confronting the legendary sniper. Several planned attacks were canceled as commanders found themselves unable to convince their men to operate in areas where Anphal might be present. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The operation had forced her to confront the reality that she had become something more than a soldier following orders. She was now a strategic weapon whose very existence influenced enemy behavior across multiple provinces. The weight of that responsibility was both empowering and terrifying. As her deployment neared its end, Sarah received orders to report to Pentagon officials who wanted to debrief her about techniques that could be taught to other snipers. She understood that they wanted to replicate her success, to create other operatives who could achieve similar psychological effects against enemy forces. But Sarah knew that what she had accomplished could not be reduced to a set of techniques or tactical procedures. The legend of Anphal had been built not just on marksmanship skills, but on an understanding of human psychology, an intimate knowledge of specific terrain, and a willingness to accept personal risk in order to protect innocent lives. During her final mission briefing, Colonel Martinez showed Sarah intelligence estimates of how many American and civilian lives had been saved as a result of her operations. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of planned attacks had been prevented simply because enemy fighters were too afraid to operate in areas where the ghost sniper might be watching. On her last day in Afghanistan, Sarah climbed to one of her favorite observation posts overlooking the valley, where she had conducted so many successful operations. As she looked through her scope one final time, she reflected on what she had learned about the nature of fear, reputation, and the responsibility that came with becoming a legend. The mountains that had been her hunting ground for nearly a year were quiet now, with enemy activity reduced to levels not seen since the beginning of the war. Villages that had been under constant threat were now safe. Children could play without fear, and medical teams could work without worrying about sniper attacks from the surrounding hills. But Sarah also understood that the legend of Anphal would outlive her deployment and continue to influence events long after she returned to the United States. Enemy fighters would still whisper her name in fearful tones, still scan the ridgelines looking for a ghost who was no longer there, still abandon operations because of threats that existed only in their imaginations. As the helicopter carried her away from the mountains for the final time, Sarah looked back at the terrain that had made her legendary and thought about the price of becoming a myth. She had saved countless lives and changed the course of military operations across an entire region, but she had also crossed a line that separated ordinary soldiers from something far more complex and dangerous. The war would continue after her departure, but the ghost in the mountains had left a mark that would endure for generations. In villages throughout Afghanistan, parents would tell their children stories about Anphal, the invisible protector who watched over them from impossible distances. And in enemy camps that still existed in remote areas, fighters would continue to fear a legend that had become more powerful than the reality it was based on. Sarah Mitchell returned home as a decorated war hero, but she carried with her the knowledge that somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, the legend of Anphal continued to fight battles she would never see, protecting people she would never meet, through nothing more than the power of fear and the enduring impact of becoming a ghost that enemies knew only by reputation.